All right, guys, so we're here to chat fats, inflammatory foods, inflammatory oils, good fats, bad fats. I got my little notebook cheat sheet here. So don't get concerned if I'm looking down too much. It's just there is a lot of information, and I want to make sure that I cover it as fluently as I can without confusing you guys too much on the way. So this isn't going to be 100% all comprehensive. If you go with me to VIP, we will re-hit this at another point, because inflammatory oils especially, it's like a really huge, deep conversation. Like, you guys can start researching it and your mind's going to be blown, because there's so much information out there about what's potentially inflammatory, what's potentially non-inflammatory. This type is, this type's not, this is how it's processed, so there's just tons of information. So what I'm gonna do here for you today is we're gonna try and break it down and simplify it. So inflammation is such a big deal because it can become chronic in nature, and that puts your immune system just in a constant state of high alert. Hello, if you guys know me, you know my story. Chronic inflammation was a big deal for a long time, which is one reason why I'm so passionate about making sure that we're having the cleanest oils that we can. So when you have long periods of chronic inflammation over and over again, over time, that starts to develop cellular damage, especially to the healthy tissues, organs, especially joints, in my case, for sure. And then and other people I know that have had kind of like joint issue things like rheumatoid arthritis and things like that. Definitely these inflammatory oils can sneak in on you, and they can be killer. Chronic inflammation is also linked to things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, and various other diseases. A lot of your diseases that end in your itises, like your arthritises, colitis, all of those are typically related to inflammation in some form or fashion. Maybe not all from inflammatory oils. That's why we try to avoid things like dairy and gluten in the faster rate of fat loss, because those can be inflammatory for some people as well. And until we eliminate those, we don't really know if that's one of your things that could be causing your itises. One of the best things to fight against inflammation that you can do is to use a combination of, number one, physical activity, because that helps kind of beef everything up. Adequate rest, because we need time for everything to calm down. And then diets, especially with foods that are anti-inflammatory in nature. Now, there are tons of foods, different foods out there that have anti-inflammatory properties. But in this video specifically, we're gonna primarily focus on oil. The reason for that is, just like I said before, that's because different foods, or even anti-inflammatory foods, can potentially be inflammatory for some people. So until you know specifically what your own tolerances and intolerances are when it comes to food, we're not going to adequately be able to address which foods you need to make sure that you're consuming a ton of, because we really kind of have to track those things over time in order to find out which anti-inflammatory foods work best for you specifically. What we are going to talk about are the foods that can cause inflammation. So what kind of foods are that? Well, pretty much everything in the SAD diet. What's the SAD diet? Well, it makes me sad to talk about because it's a standard American diet. So basically like all the foods that you're used to. Fried foods, candy, soda. But for the most part, now that you're doing the faster way, it's going to be those foods that are ultra processed, have high sugar amounts, especially added sugars. Not so much the natural sugars like your fruits and things like that, but all your added sugars, trans fats, refined flours, again, gluten, additives, and even preservatives like your nitrates and your nitrites can sometimes contribute to that. What we try to do about those foods, because we do consume them, I mean, we live in the real world, right? And we do consume some of those regularly. So it's even more reason why to make sure that the other foods that you do eat are definitely as whole food as you can get, to help counteract that, because that's how we counteract those inflammatory foods, is by consuming whole foods like whole grains, fish, beans, nuts, even some of the herbs and stuff like you use in your spices. Some of those have anti-inflammatory properties too. So what makes oil such a big deal and so complicated? Well, confusion tends to come with oils for a few reasons. The main one being that there's so many types of things that you can use to make oil. Grape seeds, cotton seeds, safflower, sunflower, soybean, peanut oil, olive oil, walnut oil, palm oil, coconut oil. I could keep going, hemp oil, but the list is really long. Instead of naming out all the oils and and trying to list them on whether they're good or bad, what most people in the nutrition world try to do is to categorize them by the predominant fat chain that they have within them. So basically breaking oils down into monosaturated, saturated, omega-3s, omega-6s. Those are the big ones. You do have your polyunsaturated fats too. That's kind of a whole different ball game. Even the categories themselves, we're not really going to dive into, because again, the more you dive into it, the deeper it gets. So trying to keep this video a little bit more simple so that it's easier to digest. So just be aware of those. You also have things like hydrogenated oils, which is like where like Crisco comes from. And those you really, if it has the word hydrogenated, especially like hydrogenated soybean oil in it, you really want to avoid it if you can, because those are super, super processed. And honestly, like animal fat, like true animal fat, like lard and things are a better substitute because they're more natural. But like I said, that's like a whole different ball game. We're not even going to get into that level of it in this episode. So we've all heard of omega-3s before, like they're found in things like fish, different types of fish that have different concentrations, but those are the ones that are considered healthier, that are considered anti-inflammatory. So good fats to choose from that are in that category are like avocado oil, olive oil, flaxseed, potentially even coconut. There's not as much research on coconut to go either way, so they just kind of go ahead and throw it in there because there hasn't been as much research that says that it's bad. It doesn't really say that it's helpful, so they just kind of go ahead and squeeze it in there with omega-3s as well, even though it's not a great source. Most of those oils are generally anti-inflammatory in nature. You also have things that you can cook with that don't necessarily give you the anti-inflammatory properties of the omega-3s, but they're also considered less inflammatory than some of the other more processed oils, and that's because they are less refined. So that's typically things like ghee, which is like clarified butter, shelf stable, and then even grass-fed butter kind of goes into the same category. Now they use grass-fed because it is pasteurized, so you get a little bit more nutrition with the grass-fed butter than you do with just like regular old plain salted butter. But typically they have close to the same amount of inflammatory or anti-inflammatory properties. But the key to that is that those olive oils, especially depending on how they're processed, the same with avocado oil, they can actually reduce the action of inflammatory oils and inflammatory markers like your interleukin-6s and even your tumor necrosis factors. Both of those promote inflammation, so things that are anti-inflammatory oils and have those omega-3s like your olive oil and your avocado, they actually help counteract that, which is another reason why they're better to use than even grass-fed butter and ghee and things like that. The oils that we really want to try to avoid are these oils that are high in your omega-6s. So those are most of your seed oils, things like corn oil, soybean oil, grapeseed oil, cottonseed, safflower, even sunflower to an extent, but we'll talk about sunflower a little bit more in a second because it does kind of flow into its own little category. But those, especially consumed in high amounts, are typically inflammatory in nature. So here's part of the problem with the American diet is that even though we do need a little bit of those omega-6s, the amount of omega-6s that we have compared to omega-3s is like, I forget what the ratio is, but it's almost like 100 to 1 or something like that. Like it's considerably more. And that's just because we have because of how much processed foods that we consume and has those cheaper oils in it, which are the omega-6s. We just typically don't consume enough omega-3s to counteract the amount of omega-6s that we do consume. The other part of that is not just the oils themselves, but it also goes into how those oils are processed or refined. So let's talk about that. So some oils are heated and refined and filtered using steam distillation, in addition to even some chemicals, which removes the nutritious aspect of those omega-6s, causing them to be potentially even more inflammatory, and it can potentially affect the fatty profile that they carry. Most of those omega-6s are typically what they call solvent expelled, meaning they use chemicals and things like that to help extract the oil from whatever the source it's coming from, whether that's corn or cotton seeds, things like that, that just aren't naturally, they're just not natural oils, guys. Like nobody's like, oh, let me go put some cottonseed oil on my salad. It's not a thing. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these two, and that will help to make things make a little bit more sense. Now, some of these oils can be expeller press. So if you see anything that's on there that's expeller press, that usually means it has the potential to have less inflammatory properties. So expeller press, meaning they put it in a machine, they squish it down till the oil comes out, and then that's it. So it's a lot less refined. They don't use the chemicals. They just use pressure to extract those oils. So they're typically a little bit more kind of in their natural state. These oils that are processed with solvents, they're like highly processed. Okay, so they, like I said, they use chemicals, things like hexane to extract the oil, and then they even use like nitrogen after it's all extracted and it's been distilled by the steam and things like that. They actually put nitrogen back into it to help kind of stabilize it. Now, when you read articles about this, it'll say, oh, the process is going on since the 1930s, and there's only trace amounts of hexane that you consume with each thing. But let's think about that for a second. Number one, what was going on in the 1930s? Anybody? The Great Depression. So what was the whole purpose of using these solvents and things like that? Was to make oil cheaper and more affordable. So as we typically know, now that we've been doing Whole Foods, cheaper and more affordable is usually less natural and not as good for you. Let's just keep that in mind too. They weren't concerned with how it was going to affect you in 20, 30, 40 years down the line. They were concerning on, were you going to be able to eat tonight? Let's also think about if we hadn't improved on anything since the 1930s, like if we hadn't improved on electricity, if we hadn't improved on technology, like you wouldn't be sitting here watching this video. So just because it's been an oldie does not necessarily mean that it's been a goodie. Oh, well, you only consume small amounts of hexane every time that you eat things. Okay, but if you guys start looking at everything and all those inflammatory oils that's in so much that we eat, even stuff that we think is healthy, like I know Kodiak is a brand, which I love Kodiak, don't get me wrong, but Kodiak is a brand that typically uses canola oil in some of their foods, which makes it seem like it's healthy. So if you're having it there and you're having it in the stuff that's not as healthy, like your potato chips, and then it's in the mayonnaise that you get, and then it's in the bread that you get at the shelf stable or things like that, well, soon it's not just a trace amount anymore. Like we all know from the old story, if you take like one grain of sand and you put it on a scale, like, yeah, it's hard to see. But if you're constantly adding another grain, even though each grain is just a trace amount, eventually it's going to build up and you're going to notice it. Guys, it's the same with these. And then we're putting extra chemicals on it too to help keep it from oxidizing. So is there a time and a place for it? Yeah. Can you consume them in small amounts? Probably, if you're truly just consuming them in small amounts, which is why it's really crucial that we do reduce it where we can. I will be the first one to tell you that on weeks that I go on vacation or things like that and I don't pay attention to those oils, first place I feel it is in my joints. Why? Because they get inflamed, because they get mad and they get irritated because I consume too much of those oils. Now, you will occasionally find things like non-GMO canola oil and high oleic sunflower oil. Even though sunflower oil was in that omega-6 category, this is where I said sunflower oil kind of gets in its own little category because too much of it, absolutely inflammatory. However, typically most sunflower oils are already made non-GMO, so they're not altered. Also, the other part is that typically sunflowers are processed through expeller pressed, so the crunching down, that's where the high oleic comes in as well. It has to do with the different refining process of them, so they're typically not as inflammatory as like your seed oils and your soybean oils. Generally speaking, it kind of gets a pass. Like it's one of those things that's not good, but if we're having to pick the lesser of the evil, we definitely would rather pick high oleic sunflower oil or even regular sunflower oil rather than canola or soybean. Expeller pressed, cold pressed, those are the best oils to get because again, they're just forming based off of the pressure and the environments that they've been pressed in. So they haven't been pressed in heat, they haven't potentially been denatured, it's just a machine that they put it in that squeezes it all out. Another important thing to talk about, in addition to just the types of oils and how they're made, that's important to consider is what you're doing with the oil itself. Because each oil has a smoke point, meaning a point in which it's going to start to burn and in which it's going to start to denature and potentially start to form free radicals. My sciencey people out there, you're going to know that free radicals potentially cause additional inflammation because it causes additional damage to the cells. So coconut oil, MCT oil, even though they're both great, both potentially anti-inflammatory, they only have a smoke point of 350. So they're pretty good at baking for the most part, but they're not really good for cooking on the top of the stove or anything like that because everything's gonna start to burn and get denatured. Olive oil, a little bit higher temperature, average of 375, sometimes a little bit lower, sometimes a little bit higher, depending on if you get expeller press, depending on if you get extra virgin or regular, although I only ever really see extra virgin everywhere. But depending on kind of the different consistency and the grade of your olive oil will depend on what smoke point it has. So higher than the coconut oil, but still not super great for stovetop cooking if you're cooking at high temperatures. It's really more like a slow roast kind of thing. Also great on salads. Ghee and avocado oil, those have higher smoke points. Most of them buck around 500. Some of them are a little bit lower, again, depending on the quality, but anywhere between like 450 and 500 is usually okay without them starting to burn and sear. So that being said, even though like sunflower oil, which you can find in the grocery store in like one of the larger containers, like you would typically find the vegetable and canola, I would probably pick like a sunflower oil or an avocado oil if I was doing a treat or needed to like actually deep fry something. I would pick that over like an olive oil because the cooking temperature is higher and you're not going to get those free radicals. That being said, sunflower oil does fall into one of those omega-6 categories. So on a regular day-to-day basis, it's not going to be something that I'm cooking with in the pan. That's going to be avocado oil. That's my go-to. So far, I haven't found anything that I can't use it in without being an adequate substitute for like canola or vegetable oil, which is what we typically grew up with. That's the short blip I have for you guys on oils and inflammatory oils and things like that. So the big takeaways are avocado oil, olive oil, coconut oil, grass-fed butter, ghee. Those are going to kind of should be your primary cooking sources on a day-to-day basis, and the primary things and things to look out for when you're looking at processed foods as something being acceptable. Same with flaxseed, although flaxseed has a little bit lower cooking point, but things we want to be more cautious of that are kind of in the middle are going to be things that are made from like safflower oil, soybean oil, peanut oil, those that we know that are still food and we can still identify them and that they are fattier, but aren't necessarily as heavy in those omega-6s. And then things to keep away from, if at all possible, are going to be those things like the cottonseed oil, vegetable oil, which is typically made from grape seeds, those seed oils especially, because those are typically, there's just not a great way to process them without potentially denaturing them because they're taking such a high pressure or needing chemicals to extract them. So those are kind of the takeaways, things to look out for as you're starting to learn more about your own nutrition labels and trying to find supplements for the things that you eat. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Like I said, the purpose of this video is just to kind of give you a short snippet because this gets really complicated really fast. But if you're sticking primarily to those main oils that we talked about, you guys are going to do just fine, and you're going to find plenty of things that you can eat and you can enjoy eating without getting the nasty inflammatory effects that some of those less ideal oils can carry. So I hope that's helpful. If it's not, let me know, or if you want more information, let me know too, because like I said, I'm very passionate about oils because it's one of the things I found in the Faster Way that I didn't know about before, and that really kind of impacted my life the most. So I'm pretty passionate about it. So if you guys have any questions, just reach out. I'll be more than happy to chat it out with you. Take care.